Alors, c'est en anglais ce soir, donc good evening everyone. We are extremely happy to welcome Daniel Barber tonight to our lecture on solar energy and architecture. Daniel is actually in Sydney, so it's very early morning for him. So this lecture series is organized as part of the monthly conferences of the Versailles School of Architecture, and it's an introduction to an event called Soleil Royale that will happen at the end of this month, and that Jeremy Lecomte is curating. As part of this series, we already had the pleasure to welcome two guests, Paul Bouet, who is an architect, teacher and researcher, a French teacher and researcher, and Florencia Colo, who is an architect from a bioclimatic design consultancy firm called Atmos Lab, based in London. So our guest, Daniel Barber, is a professor and head of school architecture at the University of Technology, Sydney. His research and teaching explore the history and future of architecture's engagement with the environment. His most recent book is called Modern Architecture and Climate, Design Before Air Conditioning, and was published in 2020. And before that, he published another book in 2016 called A House in the Sun, Modern Architecture and Solar Energy in the Cold War. So Daniel has a PhD from Columbia University, and he also had a fellowship at Harvard University, Princeton University, and the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. His current research on architecture and sufficiency is supported by a fellowship at the Center for Apocalyptic and Post-Apocalyptic Studies at the Universität Heidelberg, the British Academy, and the Guggenheim Foundation. And finally, Daniel also co-edits the series After Comfort, a User's Guide on e-flux architecture. He also commissioned texts, projects, and experiments that are focused on how we will live indoors without fossil fuels. So his lecture tonight is called Thermal Practices. It is about solar architecture, architecture beyond comfort, and what it means to conceive architecture as a thermal practice. Daniel will speak 40 to 35 minutes, and then we will have some time for discussion. So I invite you to ask a question in the chat or raise your hand and speak out. So thank you all for being there, and thank you very much, Daniel, for being with us tonight. We're very excited, and we're very much looking forward to hearing you. And Jeremy will introduce briefly the Soleil Royale.
Maybe the entire project. Yeah. Well, just very few words before letting Daniel start. So Soleil Royale is the next White Week of ENSA Versailles. So it's a week of work that is gathering the entire school. It's aimed primarily at the MA students, and there will be a series of workshops, conference. There is this cycle of conference as well, and they are all trying to explore the question of solar energy beyond the photovoltaic systems or beyond electricity, and trying also to revive the forgotten somehow history of relationships between solar energy and architecture, and exploring the future possibilities of bioclimatic design and its political ramifications. So that's why we're very pleased to welcome Daniel, who is one of the global expert, I would say, critical voice on those subjects, and very much looking forward to hearing you. Thank you, Daniel, again, for having accepted our invitation.
Good. Yeah, no, it's my pleasure. I'll jump in and get started. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. So, I mean, thank you so much to Jeremy and to Alice for the invitation, for this opportunity. It's really a great context in which to play out some of the research that I've been doing relative to what Jeremy was just articulating about a sort of, thinking about the broader shifts in architecture culture and architectural history and how they're impacting the way we tell stories and how those stories sort of, have a presence. Everything, you can still see me okay? Something weird just happened, but.
Yep.
Yeah, so it's a great context, and I guess I'll also just welcome you all to your new semester. Honored to be here on your first evening of classes, and hope maybe there'll be some inspiration, or not new semester, I guess, but new back to school, right, after the holiday. So I want to talk a bit about some different stories of architecture. I mean, in effect, precisely what Jeremy was just playing out, a kind of rethinking, rewriting of the history of architecture, with a focus on solar issues, on questions of climate. Building off, indeed, the recent lectures of my dear colleague, Paul Bouet, and what sounds like a really interesting project with Florencia Colo, trying to start to sort of map this larger historical development. Just a few images, maybe if I can. There we go. A few images from frankly from the first book, right, from the House in the Sun, that are looking at some of the solar practices in the 40s and 50s. Maybe Paul discussed some of similar materials. They begin to hint at a kind of opening up, right, of the history of architecture on these terms that sort of play out a pretty fundamental premise, or really sort of two. One is that histories of architecture have not, attempted to, and nor have they successfully sort of told the whole story, right? There's still a lot of information from the past that can help us understand practices in the present, practices in the future. Of course, histories always reflect concerns of the present, right? And those concerns have changed, of course, more and more in recent years to consider the relationship of architecture to climate and to carbon emissions and to solar energy. New contours in this sort of broader architectural narrative begin to emerge, again, as you've already been seeing in this series. And maybe it's sort of self-evident, but at the same time, what we're interested in is how changing this historical narrative, telling different stories about the past, encourages a different kind of disposition or a different kind of approach to the architecture culture of the present, right? And then, of course, looking into the future. So that's kind of part of what I'm going to be playing out with some slightly different material than what we're looking through right now. A different set of relationships for architecture and the environment, sort of traced somewhat differently, hoping to encourage a new conception of kind of what architecture is, right? And I mean, this sounds a bit, this is a bit overstated, right? But a part of what I'm trying to begin to frame, or to sort of help encourage others also to think through, is that when we think about sort of what architecture is, what we teach in schools, what we talk about when we talk about buildings, maybe we're beginning to have a perspective that's less about a sort of form giving or a certain type of aesthetic dimension to the built environment, and a bit more clearly focused on how practices, how architects and scholars and others begin to kind of frame this new conception of architects as agents of decarbonization, right? So this sort of question of what is our agency and how do we decarbonize, in many ways, is at the forefront of my mind. So that was sort of the first prelude. I'll do a quick kind of second prelude, in fact, and it won't really be my focus today. But I've been spending a lot of time the past couple of years, past couple of months more intensely, reading through a number of the reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a sort of group agency that I find at once kind of fascinating and woefully inadequate to the task in front of us. But in the technical summary of the mitigation report that was published, as you see here, in April of 2022, with solar buildings, right, solar panels on the cover. In the technical summary of this report, and here you can see my close reading there, right? The kind of careful attention to the notes and details. And it's a quick read, right? It's just a page and a half. I think everybody should take a look. But in this technical summary, the writers of this report highlight 3 principles around architecture and the climate challenge. 3 principles that I think sort of open up our discussion to these new sort of ways of thinking, to this question of agents of decarbonization, that can help to kind of frame broader questions around practice and comfort and solar and climate that I want to be touching on today. So here they are. Here's these 3 points that the IPCC played out now almost 2 years ago. First, this question of lock-in buildings, right? A proposal or a kind of indication that buildings are still too reliant on carbon, right? Even as we intervene in existing building stock, or as we build today, we tend to still be relying on carbon for energy purposes, certainly in embodied conditions. And in doing so, we produce what the UN refers to as lock-in buildings, right? Locking in more emissions, locking in more fuel use, right? Also locking in kind of more social disruption, more violence and displacement, more migration, right? As Yamina Saheb, a French scholar and one of the authors of the Buildings chapter, put it in an interview about this mitigation report, and I quote, "Each gram of greenhouse gas emissions from buildings means a mistake in the architect's design," end quote, right? So, I mean, that's kind of putting us on the spot a bit, when we think about the kind of intensity of some of the emissions that some of the buildings that we're looking at, we kind of get a sense of how we understand what is value in architecture is shifting, right? How we're kind of reimagining what we see as being a mistake or as being a sort of prominent and worthy design, right? But the issue with lock-in buildings is not only that buildings such as this demand carbon for their maintenance, for their operation, but also the extent to which they're sort of locking in or continuing to feed in a kind of infrastructure of fossil fuel growth, right? Of the continued and expanded use of fossil fuels at a time when we should be shrinking that sort of path dependency, right? We're opening up that river, we're still expanding that flow. So this question of lock-in is really about recognizing that as we specify carbon in the production of architecture, we're encouraging the kind of continued use of fossil fuels, the continued carbon emissions, even if it's kind of marginally complicated by, let's say, the use of solar panels or some other effect. So that's one piece, this sort of question of the lock-in building, right? This kind of question of what we specify and how we operate that continues to play out these same sort of terms and continues to sort of, again, kind of widen this stream of fossil fuel dependency when we should be shrinking it. A second principle gets a little closer to some of the issues I want to focus on today. Second principle from this same report. The report explains basically that what we have collectively been calling sustainable or green architecture, and I like to think of Foster's HSBC from the mid-1980s as one of the kind of first moments of this in Hong Kong. What we have been calling green architecture has focused almost exclusively on efficiency, right? On kind of doing the same thing, but doing it with less fossil fuels, right? Doing it a bit more efficiently. The whole question of performance that's emerged as the stream of sort of technological knowledge in architecture and sustainability since this time, again, focused on how to make a building run more efficiently. The issue is that we've in effect been producing the same product, right? Providing the same services as a profession. And here we see, this is Foster's building sort of directly on the right here. And then with a view to a recent Zaha Hadid architect's project still unfinished in this photograph called the Henderson, right? That's just kind of evidence that we're sort of still playing the same game, right? Right, so the premise being that we're providing the same sort of services, but just with marginally less carbon emissions, right? And so, part of what I think I'm trying to map out is how we begin to think about a more substantive shift, where, again, architects are not just sort of providing the same service, right, but are really seeing ourselves more directly as agents of decarbonization in that sense. So what the way the IPCC frames this is that all of the kind of efficiency improvements that we've related to sustainable buildings, solar panels and intelligent thermally effective glass panels, various questions of thermal mass, and even natural ventilation, et cetera, all of these kind of imperatives for efficiency over the past 40 years or so, since the mid-1980s, all of these efficiency improvements have been offset, the IPCC helps us to see, by an aggregate increase in square meters per capita, right? So we've been building more efficiently, but we've also just been building more, right? So we've kind of been adding and adding and adding, again, more square meters per person in apartments, whether suburban mansions or apartment towers in urban environments, often more square footage as well in work environments, in commercial environments, and institutional environments. We've just sort of, again, building and building taller and taller towers, as we've already seen. To quote Yamina Saheb, again, efficiency improvements were offset by a lack of sufficiency measures, right? Which is to say, by not really thinking about how much do we actually need, how much office space, how much residential space. And this becomes, I think, especially potent. I'm not sure what the situation is like in Paris right now, but in Sydney, in New York, in LA, and San Francisco, cities that I've been circulating in the past couple of months, the office vacancy rate is often in the 20 to 30%. I think in San Francisco, it's closer to 40 now, meaning there's a lot of empty office space. And so in the midst of housing crises, in the midst of climate migrations, really thinking about how we're sort of repurposing our existing building stock to consider these questions of sufficiency, to consider these questions of sort of when it's adequate, right? When we kind of have enough space. Right, so we're already kind of one element here in terms of these questions is how we begin to take a different approach to what is excellence in design, what is a kind of appropriate intervention in the built environment, what do we sort of celebrate in our field, to think about these questions of sufficiency and adequacy and sort of good enough, if you will, rather than to focus on this kind of slowly declining line of efficiency, right? And in the back of all of this, right, is this sort of clear indication that the use of the continued use of fossil fueled HVAC plants, heating, ventilation, air conditioning plants such as this one, just kind of recognition that in the midst of all of our discussions of climate crises and anxieties about disruptions and migrations, fossil fuel emissions, carbon emissions from buildings, from the building sector is continuing to increase, right? And which is to say even the rate is increasing. So we're continuing to use more and more. So the third principle, super quickly, sorry, jump back to the principles for a second. The third principle, and really in a sense, back to what we're sort of here for as scholars, as teachers, as students, is that now is really the kind of moment for transformation, right? I mean, now is really when we want to sort of shift that line. We want to sort of start looking at how we can operate differently. The IPCC suggests, again, that in order to sort of mitigate against the more extreme effects of climate instability, fossil fuel use needs to peak by 2025, right? Which is a year away, less than a year away. Right now, basically, right, is when we need to start thinking about this. And I mean, I'm not going to get into this graph too much, but it's kind of showing some of these different sort of possible trajectories. And I mean, there's a lot to discuss there in sort of broad and specific terms. But in some ways, the sort of takeaway is to recognize that the line that fossil fuels likely will peak this year, 2024, according to the International Energy Agency. But that peak will be a plateau, right? That peak will be quite extended and will be sort of flat for a while before it really starts to go down. And part of the reason for that, a big part of the reason for that, is that our building stock, again, is this kind of lock-in effect, right? That so much of our built environment requires fossil fuels to be run, that even as we try to electrify everything and electric cars and change our mobility and even change our ways of living in buildings, we still have this kind of built-in, right, demand, locked-in demand for fossil fuels. So buildings really become potent, not only because, as I'm sure many of you know, buildings are responsible for 40 to 60% of carbon emissions, depending on how you calculate it. But I think even more, dramatic and kind of desperate for those of us in the field is the recognition that buildings are part of what's making it difficult to transform, right? It's this kind of ossified, this kind of lock-in effect, this kind of infrastructural condition of it's already there, it's very difficult to transform once it's been put in place, and we're struggling to re-articulate, right, the energy condition of many of these buildings. So in many, the third principle is not only that kind of now is the time for a change, but that really this is the time to sort of upskill, right, to reskill, to kind of think about what we do as architects on different terms, to really develop not only a different approach, different conceptual perspective, as I'll be playing out a bit today, but also to develop different technical tools, different aptitudes, different ambitions, different aspirations, as we reimagine what the role of the field is in the future production of the built environment. Okay, so that's sort of prelude two, right? And I kind of want to pick up on, in a sense, on a piece of that social role, as already noted, in terms of our continued reliance upon HVAC systems. And, you know, in some ways, this is something of a American or Australian perspective, in the sense that air conditioning is ubiquitous in those regions and in many parts of the world, you know, a bit less so historically in Europe, but nonetheless, this sort of reliance upon or kind of opportunity to think about maintenance energy, operational energy, as a means to reduce emissions, right? As a means to sort of not only change how we build, change the way that we sort of imagine the primary elements of architecture, to sort of misquote Rem Koolhaas from 2014, but also to sort of imagine, how we can sort of begin to operate a bit differently. And part of what's at stake here is a recognition that these sorts of systems, right, the kind of heaters and boilers and ducts and filters and fans and registers, all of these capacities to condition the inside air, this has been the kind of hidden engine of the architectural economy, both the actual economy in terms of funding and clients, et cetera, but also the kind of cultural economy in terms of what we talk about and how we operate, right? It's all been sort of underlaid, or in this case, sort of hidden above, right? These kind of hidden systems of air conditioning and heating that have allowed, in effect, that have allowed for these debates between modernism and postmodernism, or neo-modernism, or parametricism, or pragmatism, whatever the case might be. All of that tends to be sort of, founded upon a foundation of the air conditioning system, right? Sitting behind the wall in the basement or on the roof, or again, hidden in the drop ceiling, allowing for different kinds of expression to be possible. So trying to kind of take on this question of maintenance energy a bit more aggressively, to think about not only the systems themselves and the fossil fuels they demand, but also the sort of conditions they produce, right? The comfort that we all experience in a building, to think about comfort and discomfort as a means then to sort of reflexively understanding what is at stake and considering this kind of path forward in the built environment. So a rather long set of preambles, I think an important sort of setting of the stage, always a little more than I want to do. I'm already kind of a third of the way through my allotted time, so I'll keep running, keep rolling. But just to keep that in mind, right? To keep in mind that as I go into some historical discussions and some different narratives and some different ways of thinking about architecture's past, present, and future, to keep those kind of three principles in mind, right? And to think very clearly about sort of what has allowed the world that we live in to be produced, and how we want to sort of, reimagine that world and frankly produce a new one, right? I really, just to close this piece up, I really see this sort of crises of climate disruption not so much as a sort of opportunity to lament the end of a way of life, but really the opportunity to kind of celebrate a new one, right? To kind of look at what we can produce as creative people, as designers, as architects, as scholars, as a kind of celebration of what can be, of what is to come, of how we can in fact live differently, as we clearly need to do. So I'm going to talk through a sort of historical comparison that you already see here on the screen to do a sort of comparative analysis that, again, helps us to kind of look back at some of these histories, you know, a very thin slice, of course, in the next kind of 20, 30 minutes. A very thin slice that allows us to consider the question of thermal practices, right? Of sort of how we build as architects, how we design a sort of condition for a certain type of thermal interior, a certain type of thermal environment, but also to think about what happens inside these buildings, right? How the production of a certain type of thermal space provided by the architect as sort of one practice, right, also allows for a certain occupational practice, a certain type of life inside. So this kind of dynamic between what the architect designs as a sort of set of thermal systems, and then how the building is occupied, is used, is lived in, is worked in as a means of understanding this kind of dynamic that produces carbon emissions or allows for their reduction, both through design and occupational practices. So on the left, right, yeah, you see the Equitable Insurance Building in Portland, Oregon, designed by Pietro Belushi and completed in 1947, Portland, Oregon, in the northwest of the US, as you may know. This building is generally regarded, I'll just zoom into another image, generally regarded as one of the first with a fully sealed glass curtain wall, right? So you can see in this interior view, you can't open these windows, right? This is a kind of sealed component. An absolute reliance on an extensive heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system, right? And we can, like this little grill down here becomes the kind of lifeblood, right? Without air coming in and being sucked out through that system, this building could not be occupied. The building used a reverse cycle heat pump system that relied on groundwater for heating and cooling spaces such as these. It was responding in part to an imperative right after World War II for full employment in the region, again, the U.S. Pacific Northwest, and in effect was kind of taking advantage of what was seen as an abundance of cheap power, I'm putting that in quotes, due to the relatively non-polluting hydropower plants, right, dams and other systems on the Columbia River. And that's a sort of separate story about the kind of mechanization of water systems for the production of energy. You know, so we can begin to see, and we kind of see it even a little more, and if you'll forgive me, a little historical leap into this other building on the right. This is an image from the interior of the United Nations headquarters, built about 5 years later. We begin to indicate some of the effects of this kind of broad trajectory, right? This kind of reliance on HVAC, this reliance on this kind of turning of the knob, right? This kind of designed alienation from systems and infrastructures, again, that allow this building to be inhabited. And you can see, again, this is the same interior image of the Equitable building itself to give us a sense of, right, kind of the effects of that. In discussing an early version of his design, Belushi wrote, and I quote, "Our assumptions were affected by by the peculiar circumstances found in our Northwest region, cheap power, and a tremendously expanded production of light metals for war use, which will beg for utilization after the emergency," end quote. So Belushi was noting that during World War II, the Boeing airplane production plant, which is 100 miles or so north of Portland, demanded a lot of energy to produce planes for wartime purposes. After the war, that seemingly excess energy was then available, right? So as he puts it, let's sort of find a way to utilize this after the emergency, right? So to kind of, in effect, continue that state of emergency in terms of energy use, and buildings became the medium to do so, right? It was through construction of energy-intensive buildings such as this that we were able to sort of use that excess energy, right, that had been produced for wartime purposes. And I note that, I hope a bit carefully, to both to indicate that kind of sense of this ongoing emergency, right? The kind of fossil fuel economy as the emergency, in a sense, more than the climate crisis. I mean, I guess both, but to recognize that this emergency is very well embedded in our economic system. But also to recognize that, you know, I'm not in identifying some of these architects that I'll be talking about in no way trying to say, like, people like Belushi, we'll look at Van der Rohe in a minute, were somehow misapprehending or were kind of bad architects or kind of, they were doing what was expected of them in their time, right? Which was to use as much energy as possible. I mean, that was in effect the brief for a building such as this, was to shepherd through and elaborate on and support this, what's been referred to as the Great Acceleration, right? The kind of increase in demand of energy systems. And there's a whole dynamic here in terms of how buildings demanded more and more energy. That energy then, of course, produces more and more economic products in general, and sort of, again, widens the stream of the infrastructural throughput of energy systems, and produces economic growth and produces economic health. And there's a whole sort of aspect of this that goes far beyond buildings, of course, and our life inside them. But it's a kind of chance to understand how buildings have been essential to that. Okay. So the petrocultural theorist Graham MacDonald refers to sort of buildings such as these. Here's another iconic one. He doesn't refer to buildings per se. He refers to oil used for buildings such as these as what he refers to as a monstrous transformer. As MacDonald writes, oil produces the most violent logic of all energy forms, because it militates against alternative imaginative forms of representation, right? Part of the point of theorizing energy as cultural, as I'm starting to play out today in some sense, is to expose and determine the reasons for our own acculturation to its hierarchy, right? So our own kind of acceptance of spaces such as this as sort of elite and valued spaces by virtue of almost, in a sense, their demand for energy. So it's to note that, we're sort of all soaked in oil, right? We wear it, we breathe it, we eat it. It's specifically in our heated and cooled spaces, and in buildings such as this, the Seagram's Tower that I assume many of you are quite familiar with, we again recognize that part of the project was to sort of to increase energy demand as much as possible for economic purposes. That Mies van der Rohe, in designing this in the mid-1950s, was in fact following these imperatives, right? And this was a moment when, and if any of you have seen the blockbuster movie Oppenheimer, the kind of evil, I'm not trying to spoil anything, but the kind of evil protagonist at the end, Strauss, as he's referred to in the movie, was at this time in 57, 58, the director of the Atomic Energy Commission, and had proposed that energy that would soon be too cheap to meter, right? Would soon be so bountiful, so available because of nuclear energy, that we wouldn't even have to charge for it, right? So there was this sense of this kind of never-ending supply of energy that buildings such as this were intended to take advantage of. And you can kind of get a sense of that when you recognize that these heating registers are right at the edge of this very thin curtain wall, right? So in the Seagram's building, when the heat's turned on, you're kind of really just heating the lower atmosphere of Midtown Manhattan. He was doing what he was supposed to do at the time. Amazing architect, of course, but as we see it today historically, as we think about the impact of this building, it's one of the worst performing buildings we could imagine, and just sort of helps to set up this notion that the ways that we've been building and the kind of models that we've been following themselves need to transform. So locked in, baked in, right? The ways in which, again, our building stock really kind of encourages us to have a specific relationship to the environment and to the atmosphere and to the sort of conditions of climate and their potential disruption. Okay. So one of the pleasures of architectural history is that it provides many compelling examples of life before this monstrous transformer, or really kind of alongside it, right? Before fossil fuels, before air conditioning and HVAC systems became so fully embedded in our ways of life, right? And it's important to note that, there's an aspect of this of many cultures around the world living without air conditioning over this period, right? What we're really talking about is how those who have consumed the most fuels and produced the most emissions can start to kind of shift their ways of thinking and ways of life. So I want to briefly survey some buildings from a kind of a parallel trajectory, right? Again, following on the building now on the right, built in Rio de Janeiro in 1945, about the same time, roughly. Very different economic and political and social context, but that a building that relies that doesn't rely as much at all, really, on mechanical systems for heating and cooling, less comfort on relative terms, that perhaps begins to imagine a sort of sufficient condition for the provision of comfort in the thermal interior, using non-mechanical means, that is to say, using architectural strategies through design rather than through HVAC systems. And again, that's part of what I'm sort of trying to play out here today is, when we think about what design does, what its kind of function is in society, part of what I'm trying to suggest is that it can help us to decarbonize, right? It can help us to think differently about our relationship to fossil fuels. And in the case of architecture, of course, not only to think differently, but to build different products. So again, the comparative example on the right is the Edifício Mamãe, built by the firm M.E. Roberto in Rio in Brazil in 1945. Three of the brothers of the firm, two of the M's had studied with Lucio Costa, right? So sort of had a type of modernist pedigree in that sense. And this building was produced for them to live in, for themselves and for their mother. And as you can see in the photograph, I don't know if you've spent any time in Rio, but this is on Copacabana Beach. And, this is just sort of one little sliver of what's now a kind of wall of high-rise towers, but this was very early, right? So this was in the kind of beginnings of the Brazilian economy booming during the 1940s, booming in part because of isolation from World War II, and in part because of a sort of authoritarian regime of the then President Getúlio Vargas, who was sort of consolidating political and economic power, which I'll come back to briefly in a minute. But in stark contrast, right, to the building on the left, this project is really about a porous facade, right? Is about the kind of capacity to interact with the facade. It's a dynamic facade that almost sort of provides a script, right? Sort of choreographs a dance between the inhabitant, which is to say the modes of inhabitation, the life inside, the way that you kind of operate as an individual or as a group within that space. And the facade itself as this kind of mediating device, right, to help you understand again and interact with the exterior. So one could imagine, here's this, this section of this facade. You can imagine you sort of wake up in the morning, perhaps, and open up the sash to allow some of the morning breeze, right? Certainly at noon, you have these fixed vanes that are going to always be stopping the sun in the midday heat that is quite characteristic of Rio. In the evening, you have this kind of option to move the screen up and down. You have these different adjustable blinds, right? So this whole sort of set of operations, very different than the knob, right, that we saw being turned at the UN. A whole set of operations, a whole kind of experience, a whole kind of aesthetic, if you will, or a relationship to your experience of the world that is determined or sort of managed not only by the design of the facade, but by the kind of designed operations, again, the sort of choreography or scripting that the architect provides as a means to think about and condition the interior in very dynamic ways. The Roberto brothers were, we could say, sort of masters of this form, and I'll just kind of quickly sort of run at a tight clip through a few of their buildings. Here, the Marquês do Herval, where you have a simple metal screen, and part of what's important here is you're kind of seeing this demonstration, right? I mean, here's a ambitious group of Brazilian architects in the early 1950s, building these buildings, getting these commissions, often from government agents, but publishing them around the world, right? I mean, publishing photographs such as this on the far right in Architecture d'Aujourd'hui, for example, in many journals in the US and the UK and France, Germany, Australia, to kind of show like this is how we want to do this, right? I mean, this is a sort of demonstration photo to say this is, a kind of public relations photo to say, as architects, part of our job is to kind of consider these climatic patterns and understand how to mitigate them, right? I mean, even this very simple gesture of sort of opening and closing this sun-breaking device, as we see here. This is one of my favorites of theirs, the Edifício Seguradoras, which is basically a speculative building for insurance companies. And again, another kind of side narrative about the importance of insurance to the production of modern economies and fossil economies in particular. Some of the first modern buildings produced in Brazil were to house insurance agents so that those coming in to invest, right, could kind of insure their investments and land purchases, et cetera. again, won't get into that in any great detail, but you can see, the kind of dynamism of different devices to block the sun. You have this kind of fixed system on top. You have these also this kind of flue that draws the hot air away from the facade itself. This sliding system here, and then again, as we can see in the diagram, this kind of lever, right, that allows you to move it up and down and get a sense in the facade there how one might operate differently according to different needs, different desires, different modes of occupation, right? It's not a uniform system. It's not a sealed curtain wall, right? It's a very complex, dynamic facade. Another example, a bit more simple, just a kind of set of horizontal screens and then a set of vertical screens, and you can sort of interweave them, intermesh them so as to produce more or less shading. This is in fact in Bahia, in further north in Brazil, where it gets a bit more hot, frankly, in the summertime. This one designed by Paulo and Tunes Ribeiro, and then others by Costa, others by Afonso Redi, who also designed the Pedregulho complex. Some of you may know, where this kind of shading even takes on almost a sort of monumental scale. And many of you have probably seen, and this kind of ties us back a little to our familiar narratives. This is the example of Brazilian shaded modernism that's in the textbooks, right? The Ministry of Education and Health, designed by Oscar Niemeyer, Lucio Costa, and many others, not by Le Corbusier, I'm sorry to say. Happy to play that out in questions as well. As Barry, the historian and curator, Barry Bergdahl, put it in his 2015 exhibition at the New York Museum of Modern Art called Latin America Under Construction, Bergdahl wrote that the emergence of a distinctly South American modernism, as we're seeing here, involved projects and buildings that, and I quote, are not the belated reflections of examples set in Europe, but previsions of a modernization to come, right? So this sense that what we're seeing in Brazil and what I've just kind of been walking through aren't just sort of bad versions or derivative versions of a sort of European modernism, right? But are really a kind of self-generated set of understandings of a certain set of conditions and how to operate within them, right? And those conditions were deeply informed by scientific knowledge. Here we're just seeing some little bits of this. I have a graduate student who's deeply engaged in these archives and getting more and more materials from some of these figures who were performing these meteorological and climatological analyses to understand how the sun operated in Rio so that those shading systems and screens and those choreographies could be most tightly considered, right? How we could begin to understand the dynamics of a building and its relationship to the climate for all the complexity. And we now know, of course, the climate is much more complex than might have been imagined in this kind of late 30s, 40s, 50s period, but nonetheless evidence of this kind of ambition to integrate building styles and sort of approaches to the built environment, integrate that with a new type of meteorological, a new type of climatological knowledge. So there's a point here that's not only sort of historical, but also, let's say, historiographic, right? Which is to say that, how we understand the contours of history, which is to note that modern architecture was able to be disseminated around the world, I want to suggest, in projects and buildings because of its capacity to manage thermal comfort through design, right? This is, again, before air conditioning, or kind of alongside it, before air conditioning was sort of widely available. Climate sensitive design, the sort of dynamic, active facades allowed, again, for the, if you'll forgive me, the globalization of the international style, right? A trajectory that sort of flowed, in fact, from south to north, as Bergdahl suggests, focusing the project of modernism on the building as a device for climatic adaptability and kind of reimagined today, perhaps, around this question of decarbonization. An energetic system, to be sure, but one that emerged through design method rather than reliance on mechanical systems, right? And of course, this global dissemination of the climate responsive facade, if we can begin to call it that, and I'm not providing adequate evidence today to sort of make this global sweep, but in the book referenced Modern Architecture and Climate and in the research and archives of many colleagues, that knowledge is beginning to disseminate more widely. But this global dissemination of a climate responsiveness, in a strange sort of way, as we'll see, was just sort of paving the way for a different disposition, for a different sort of approach, again, to that thermal interior and its experiences. Another kind of side note to sort of unpack perhaps some questions is buildings such as this, a building designed by Fry, Drew, Drake, and Lasden and built in 1960 to the headquarters of British Petroleum in Lagos, Nigeria. Complicates our story a little bit, right? I mean, I want to be clear that I'm not trying to suggest that there was some sort of benevolent, kind of generous approach to buildings with shaded systems that somehow exclude them from the broader contours of modern architecture and colonialism, right? That somehow were some sort of solve or separate space from these broader and significant economic and social systems. What we see, in fact, is that the kind of capacity to shade a building and to sort of delicately understand how one could design for a different type of interior disposition allowed for buildings to kind of insert themselves into some of these neo-colonial contexts first, if you will, right? It became this kind of avant-gardism, not in the sense of a kind of design excellence, but in the sense of a kind of commercial intervention, right? In the sense of kind of getting there first again. So, yeah, I mean, the story here that is a bit too convenient for that to make that point is that this building opened, the BP House, British Petroleum House in Lagos, opened the day, October 1st, 1960, the day of Nigeria's independence from the UK. So we almost see this kind of handoff, produced in architecture between the sort of colonial regime of the British government to the kind of neo-colonial corporate extractive regime of British Petroleum. And if you know anything about the fate of the Niger Delta from this period, the extraction of oil has decimated the Nigerian economy, the Nigerian ecosystem, many Nigerian people, to the point of, and this sounds like conspiracy theory, but it's well documented, to the point of Shell Oil and BP hiring hitmen to kill activists that were trying to protest oil incursions into their villages and homes, right? So a pretty glaring extreme example, right? But an indication that, again, that these shaded systems had many different dimensions. Right. So to start to kind of close up a little bit and look forward to some questions. The modernization that came, to return to Bergdahl's quote, as we know, was not the kind of shaded dynamism envisioned by the climate methodologists in Brazil or elsewhere, but a very different passage to a very different kind of life. And we see here one indication, the shading system from this building, very delicately articulated, has been stripped. You can see a little bit of evidence of some of the coolers, the air conditioners that are then sort of placed upon these ledges, right? And we have this kind of set of dynamics across the 70s, 80s, and 90s, whereby these shading screens and other sorts of systems were again taken off and replaced in these cases by in-window air conditioning units, right? One of the most carbon-hungry means of cooling a space, right? So this kind of dynamic where we recognize that what's at stake is not only the increase in energy, right? The fact that because air conditioning wasn't specified initially, there's no space for the heaters and coolers or the kind of mechanical systems that I started with. So you have these very energy intensive, in-window units, really kind of the bane of our collective existence. But also to recognize that the sort of shading that was provided by this system, or even by this system a bit more dynamically, it came to be inadequate, right? It was kind of comfortable enough in the 40s and 50s, but as times changed and as air conditioning proliferated around the world, it came to be seen as not enough, right? As insufficient, right? It came to be seen as requiring more extensive mechanical intervention, right? And you see here again, as all of these sort of delicate systems were stripped out and these sort of protrusions, these almost kind of eaves were used primarily to support these different chiller units, right? Cooling, again, the interiors of these rooms. So we see both a kind of change in dynamics in terms of the availability of energy, right? The provision of mechanical systems, but also a dramatic change in dynamics in terms of the comfort that's anticipated in the interior, right? And the kind of what we're expecting, what we see as kind of a norm or a universal or a sort of means of living comfortably. So I want to stop here, but part of what I'm trying to identify in this dynamic, well, a couple of things, right? I mean, on the one hand, the project of architecture is articulated here in this comparison, is articulated as a means of intervening in the building, right? Or sort of in the, not the existing building per se, but in the sort of broader construct of the building industry and the kind of production of the built environment. Intervening as a means to sort of insert this kind of adaptability aspect, right? This kind of capacity for engaging different sort of climatic conditions on the right, as opposed to this kind of sealed, static, kind of universal premise on the left. And then second, as we begin to think about our own role as architects in the current dynamic and in the current environment, we can begin to see that part of what's at stake here is wouldn't have been conceived as such at the time, but how we can really begin to sort of imagine ourselves as agents of decarbonization. And I'll sort of stop with this last slide from a project I mentioned in passing a moment ago, Afonso Geri's Pedregulho housing complex in the hills of Rio, where we see this kind of refurbishment, right, of these kind of monumental wooden shading fins as part of a project of kind of re-scripting the environment, of sort of decarbonizing this building, rather than just sort of relying on some of these air conditioning units that we can begin to see. A complex decarbonization process that involved inhabitants, that involved a series of regulatory interventions, right? That was not just a sort of architect having a bright idea, although it was that too. But it was also about kind of understanding the complex social, economic, and sort of policy issues that were at stake, and finding a way to intervene amidst them to produce a renovation to the structure that did not also demand more fossil fuel throughput. I think I might stop there if we're about at time. I've got some sort of concluding images, but maybe I'll jump back to them if we need to in discussion. So thanks for your time. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Daniel.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Trying to figure out how to get out of here. There we go.
Perfect. Nice. Thank you very much. And thank you again for giving this great lecture that early in the morning for you. Alice, maybe you said we will be taking questions in the chat.
Yes.
That's what
yes,
you
so
did, right?
I mean, there are two options. So we can take question. You can ask question by raising your hand with the reaction button,
Right.
or you can also write your question down in the chat.
Okay. Maybe meanwhile, a first question, maybe like let's start with like an easy factual one.
Sure.
Because I think it was very interesting. I think to sort of the sort of diagram that you proposed as a collarbone to this lecture between two different ways of envisioning the passivity of architecture, right? One will be like sealing things and being, passive in such a way that that nothing moves in a way, and that you're relying extensively on machines to actually make this building work from the inside, right? So it's like an encapsulated, sealed shell in a way. And the other that suppose more attention to to things that needs to be moved, things that need to be actioned by people. Do you think like that when we talk about architecture and solar energy today, when we talk about the need to move beyond that model of comfort or thermos-like buildings, do you think there is a need also to call for being more active in the actual use of buildings?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, right? And I think that gets to a real frustration, or I don't know, sort of pet peeve, as I might call it. As you're suggesting, the way that we talk about solar energy in buildings, an active solar installation is one that demands electricity, right? Is usually photovoltaic panels, and the active term is used to suggest that there's a kind of mechanical system that gets deployed, right? Whereas a passive structure is one that simply works with the sun or through thermal materials or through its design. I mean, again, all this, but as a means to take advantage of solar incidence, of solar insolation. And again, what I think you're beginning to suggest, and I mean, I've written about this in a slightly different context vis-a-vis the 1970s. We kind of want to switch that. Right. I mean, that really what we're talking about is a kind of active engagement with the thermal environment through our own, that facade image that I focused on from the Edge of Fushima Mai becomes a kind of emblem of this, for me at least, that, how we kind of interact, how we sort of rely upon our own sensibilities and capacities to really reimagine and transform our experience of the interior. So that what we've called passive is in fact imperative for action, and what we've called active is is in fact this kind of notion that we might kind of sit back and let the systems handle it for us, right? And I think there's a couple of things at play there. I mean, I don't know. I might sort of bracket out for a second the whole question around the passive house, which obviously is implicated in some of this, insofar as the passive house is a sealed building, quite differently than the sealed curtain wall office tower, but nonetheless following some similar kind of technological streams. But I think the important piece of it is this kind of recognition that we have the capacity and even the kind of need to interact with our environment in different ways today than we have in the past, right? And we're trying, I think, to cultivate, and I guess I'm saying this maybe both as a teacher and I, frankly, in some ways as a father, right? I mean, trying to sort of cultivate in the next generation an appreciation for the different types of lifestyles and kind of modes of occupation or kind of ways of living, collective living, which entail engagement with the building in different ways, right? Which is not just kind of using your Nest thermostat or turning a dial, but which is about, you might occupy one room in the summer more than some other room in the winter, right? And you kind of have this different experience of the house, a kind of active engagement with the house's thermal systems, or the commercial office space for that matter. There's a firm here in Sydney that has an office that has a beautiful view of the Sydney Harbor, but of course it gets super hot in the summer. And because they're doing what is referred to as hot desking, right, where kind of different people can move around and according to different needs, there's a seasonally distinct competition, for different desks, right? In the winter, everybody wants to be on the edge. In the summer, everybody wants to be back in, right? And because they're smart architects, they've kind of mapped this all out and sort of tried to develop solutions, et cetera. But just to say that, we want to really encourage a sort of approach to the built environment and to our inhabitation of it that assumes that we have that capacity for action, to kind of be active in those conditions, right? And which obviously has other dimensions in terms of the food we eat and the way we get around, and this kind of broader sense of a sort of consciousness of our relationship to the climate, right?
And I think, I mean, in terms of in relation to architecture, there is. It seems that it implies such a form of reversal of expectations in a way, right? Because what we used to call active, and I think in a way you term like the whole comfort paradigm that you talk about, it implies a lot of automation and implies some sort of passivity from the subjects, from humans, while the passivity of architecture, in a way that you talk about, even if you're just talking about blinds, or if you needs to be activated somehow. And I think this is interesting.
I mean, you mentioned in the introduction, and I sort of cut myself off, but I was about to jump into a few slides that look at the recent project I've been co-editing on e-flux. After Comfort, a user's guide, which has been bringing in essays and projects and poems from around the globe to really again think about how will we sort of live together after fossil fuels and in terms of our designed interiors. And the first project that we published, the first essay published, really clarifies it quite well. By a Polish curator named Alexandra Kadziorek, called The Clothed Home. And it's a project, frankly, that she's exhibited, she's been working on for some time. It was at the Lisbon Triennale and a few other places, where she describes how when heating fuel was still quite expensive in the north of Poland, even that's to say in the kind of modern era, right? There was a practice of hanging up textiles, rugs, blankets, other sorts of bespoke products around the house, on walls and hallways, over doorways, as the weather cooled. Basically increase insulation, right, and kind of thermally isolate different rooms, and so a whole sort of practice again, sort of slow choreography over months, if you will, of hanging up and taking down different elements in the house to sort of clothe and unclothe the house according to its different seasonal conditions, right? And I think we all probably, I mean, not to make too many assumptions, but I think we all have some kind of minor versions of that, right? I mean, sort of when you're accustomed to having a window open or a shade drawn, or maybe that in the summer you have to have your shades drawn so the sun doesn't wake you up at 5 a.m, but in the winter you can keep them open. We have some kind of general sense of how our bodies and buildings kind of interact with these broader geophysical dynamics, and so part of it is just trying to kind of dial that up, right? But also to suggest, and this is the kind of thermal practices bit, right? Also to suggest that when we're designing spaces and when we're intervening in existing built fabric and retrofitting and renovating spaces, that we really have a chance to, again, script or sort of choreograph or provide a context through which the inhabitant, the user, can kind of amplify those effects, right? And yeah, so a couple of great examples of that also at play in this series.
Yeah.
Nobody's writing questions yet.
No.
I was going to say it's too early, but it can't be too early. It's too late.
Yeah.
It's allowed to ask in French. Huh?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, you can write your questions in French and
or even ask them in
I
French.
will translate them. Ou pour le dire en français, vous pouvez écrire vos questions en français dans le chat et on les traduit.
Ou les poser en français.
Ou les poser en français. Well, then, I mean, I have a second one, but Alice, you may have one as well.
No, go ahead.
No, so, well, maybe a bigger one then, but because, I've noticed also there is a friend here who have written a great book drawing on this recently, drawing on this, the thing that Victor Hugo said about Notre Dame, saying like, this will kill that, right? And the idea that the invention of printing will actually kill architecture in the sense that architecture won't be anymore this, a media, an effective media in a way, because printing would be much more efficient. And so he's elaborating on that, and I think in a very interesting way to explain how, and we've seen that like in the 70s with archism, for instance, arguing that that there was like a destruction of architecture by media and technology in a way. Brenzi saying that you will only need, for planning a city, you will only need to design an electric plug every 5 meters, right? And all this. So a kind of general history of architecture receding in the background in a way, because of the ways in which media and technology were much more effective to provide information, notably, but also sometimes to provide for even like, you know, if you think about thermal practices like clothes and the whole evolution of, you know, of materials that we're using for that. And I'm just, you know, it's an hypothesis, an hypothetical question, but drawing on what we were saying just before, I'm just wondering whether like this whole crisis we're facing and what we sense is needed to be radically transformed in our relationship to architecture and the environment isn't like an opportunity to actually put architecture back to the forefront again. Because when we talk about passive strategies, I think it's the way I understood what Florencia Colo was saying about all the calculations they're making about buildings is really like this sealed thermos model of a building relies on machines and technology quite heavily to the point where architecture is not important really anymore. You know, it can be a box and we'll figure it out, right? Like you showed at the end with, you know, plugging all sorts of ventilation or air conditioning systems. But when you try to really think about how building can be efficient in environmental ways, then you need to think again about design quite heavily, and you need to put design at the forefront. So all that to say, like, do you think there is an opportunity there also to reinvest, you know, let's say the power of architecture in formal or material terms?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you know, it's an interesting way to think it through. I mean, you know, I think that what we're, you know, and this is a sort of book that hasn't been written, I don't think, but, you know, when we think about the kind of media architects of the 60s and 70s, right? I mean, this was also the moment of the massive, rapid expansion of fossil fuels, air conditioning systems around the world, right? I mean, that changed relationship to the sort of capacities for form to communicate, right? Or sort of the capacities for the building to articulate was also embedded in, the kind of uniformity of the HVAC system, right? I mean, that was, you know, a big part of that plug. I mean, I can think back to The House Is Not a Home, right? The Banham de la Grey sort of bubble, right? In which all the kind of mechanical systems and media systems were contained within, and kind of what else happens, you know, still interesting, still potentially important, but on different terms, right? And I think part of what we're, you know, in the introduction to the climate book, what I try to do something kind of similar, which is to refocus ourselves on the fact that you know, media is on the one hand about that kind of communicative capacity and about that sort of distinguishing capacity, and I'm quite interested in how these different facades sort of communicate in that sense and sort of articulate a certain relationship to energy. But medium is also, you know, the kind of material weight, right, of the building, and the kind of, you know, to kind of think about oil in a sense as a kind of media, right, or as a kind of communicative device that that we are still quite dependent upon, and Friedrich Hitler, the media theorist, has this famous phrase, media determine our situation, right? And I think there's a really important, which again, very complex, and I'm sort of dumbing it down a little bit here, but you know, it's part of what someone like Graham McDonald, a kind of petrocultural theorist, right, is also sort of playing out, right? That it's hard for us to think outside of the fossil fuel regime, right? And I think part of what we want to see, part of the renewed creativity in our field is, I mean, it's in part about, okay, we can kind of recapture some of that descriptive and articulative aspects of the field, but I think it's also this sort of burgeoning of creativity around how we move past the fossil fuel period, right? And sometimes that, you know, that can be very experimental and very, you know, in the same way as the kind of Archizooms and other projects from that period. You know, we can also look at, I mean, very sort of, I don't want to call them mainstream, but accomplished, established practices such as, you know, Lacaton and Versailles, of course, are quite focused on this. I mean, all sorts, you know, Farshid Musavi Architects has been doing great work on this. Karen McCuo, I mean, one could go through a whole realm of sort of attempts to, yeah, to kind of reimagine what these fossil fueled worlds mean and how we kind of get ourselves outside of them, right? And I think what it sounds like the previous lecture was playing out, and something that I've been getting caught up with a lot as an administrator in terms of thinking about, you know, research and courses on offer and curricula. Yeah, how we disrupt the technological trajectories we're on, right? I mean, architectural science has built itself up with a set of parameters, a set of determinants that feed into the all glass sealed curtain wall skyscraper, you know, finding other sort of pathways and trajectories to emphasize and to cultivate, right? So thinking about passive solar, thinking about creative use of materials, of course, questions of retrofit and reuse, you know, we're talking about timber structures, et cetera. Like all of these are how to sort of move it from the kind of one-off project to the kind of, you know, system that we operate within, right? How we sort of explore these different trajectories of technological development. You know, if I'm understanding correctly from Florencia, you know, this real sense of it's hard to dislodge, right? I mean, you go into a large-scale architecture firm or a prominent architecture school, and you know, there's brilliant research going on about how to make that curtain wall facade even more efficient, right? And you know, that's kind of been our stream, right? And how we kind of produce other streams and kind of dislodge some of those that we recognize are really just sort of permission structures and still quite carbon dependent. It becomes a really important cultural project, right? A really important pedagogical project that I think we're just at the cusp of, frankly, just getting started with. Yeah.
Thanks. Like we do have a question.
Yes.
Okay.
It's from Nicolas Dorval-Bory. Nicolas, shall we read the question, or do you want to? I can read it through. I don't know. It's up to you. I think you can switch on your
I've
mic.
got it. Yeah.
You got it? Shall I read it or no? Or shall we read it for? I don't know if everybody can read the question. I don't know.
It's a long one. Getting there.
Okay, I can go through. Should I?
Maybe I can summarize it if that's easier.
Sure.
You know, I mean, it's a very thoughtful indication of the sort of challenges of the isolation of thermal spaces as being very, let's say, culturally uneven, right? You know, North American, European examples, but of course in other environments, it's quite different, quite distinct, and the kind of gap between the interior and the exterior can be different in let's say tropical climates or other spaces. So now I'm getting to the actual question. Let's see. Okay. I think what's on the table is two things. One is a question of, if we look back at traditional practices, if I can put it that way, at modes of building, let's say before. I mean, you know, I'm gonna kind of riff off of this in a slightly different direction. Modes of building. You know, one of the things that modernism, as a intervention in architectural discussions, tried to do, in effect, was to delegitimate customary practices, right? Was to say that the kind of ways of building of the past are no longer legitimate, right? We will move forward in a progressive and new way, right? And, you know, to be a bit too schematic, part of what we're coming to terms with is how damaging that progressive imperative has been to our natural environment, right? And our ecosystem and our climate. So there's a sense of, and you know, part of this question is you know, how we kind of maybe link ourselves to different solutions from the past. And there's a great phrase by the philosopher Kate Soper, who's been writing a lot about, let's say, kind of low energy pleasures, right? I mean, kind of modes of moving forward as a society that rely less on carbon. And she uses this phrase it's quite difficult in architecture. She's not, you know, she's writing in a broader context, but she uses this phrase avant-garde nostalgia, right? And this is not nostalgia for the avant-garde, which we might be familiar with in our field, but rather a premise that there's a kind of cutting edge of looking to the past, right? There's a way in which we can kind of explore practices and techniques and theories and buildings and ways of living from before fossil fuels, let's say, or sort of before air conditioning in my framing, as a means to think about how we can operate in the present, right? Sort of bring back some of those practices and materials and systems, and not uncritically, right? Not nostalgically, right? I mean, that's the kind of avant-gardist piece, right? To kind of be thinking back pleasantly, or sort of capturing some aspects that are useful from that period, but doing so in a way that really emphasizes their relationship to technologies in the present and the way that we can sort of reimagine them, right? So I think there's an aspect of recognizing that, in fact, Jeremy, you put this on the table in your introduction. This is not new material, right? I mean, in fact, what we can really identify is that kind of 1920 to 2020, let's say, optimistically, right, was the kind of fossil fueled period of the world, of the built environment in particular. And now that we're trying to build differently, we recognize there's kind of centuries of knowledge that we can begin to take advantage of, right? And that we can elaborate on and technologize and make more efficient and sort of do lots of things with, right? And so, so to really recognize that we're at a juncture, I think, globally, right, that says, okay, again, something has ended, right? I mean, a certain type of energy regime, we hope, is coming to a close. I mean, despite the fact that all of the IPCC meetings are being chaired by oil executives, right? I mean, despite the kind of mainstream discourse seemingly becoming more and more feeble as the issues get more and more intense, we can either recognize or encourage this kind of period of time to come to a close and to move forward into a different era. And that's an era that will rely upon a lot of different systems and can kind of look back to the past in very different ways. There's a second part of this question that I don't quite understand that has to do with, right, cooling. If I get it right, it's that heating in some way, heating is much less energy intensive than cooling, generally speaking, as in terms of mechanical systems. And I think in the European condition in particular, and as I noted, a bit less infused with air conditioning and kind of the built environment than, say, the US or Australia or some other parts of the world. Cooling seems to be the easy one to readapt ourselves relative to. It seems relatively recent, and why can't we just, and I think there's a lot to that, that there's a kind of cultural memory of managing summertime temperatures that's quite different than that of managing the need for heat in the winter. I guess the one sort of caveat, or the one thing that gets me a little freaked out, well, two things. One is the question of humidity, right? That in everything that I've been saying, and I'm in effect talking about sort of passive non-mechanical strategies of cooling or of comfort. I mean, not necessarily cooling, but of maintaining a comfortable interior. None of them are addressing humidity, and that's going to be increasingly a problem as the world heats up and gets more humid over the coming decades. We're going to need to get really creative about ways of life and ways of building that kind of help to mitigate the factor of overhumid of the humidity intensity as much as the heat intensity. But I think the other issue, and this is part of, and again, there's so many just sort of terrifying dynamics here, right, is that I think it's true that it's easier to imagine a sort of readaptation to less cooling in the present. I'm sure you're all quite familiar with some of the studies that have indicated that Paris, along with Amsterdam, are the two European cities most vulnerable to overheating in the coming decades. That has to do with climatic and geographical issues, and also has to do with sort of tree cover. And in the case of Paris, it's more about the banlieue than the arrondissement, but nonetheless, as a region, is quite vulnerable to high heat, right? So I think that this is going to get more and more complicated as things go on. Our reliance upon, this is the kind of challenge that we face, is that as cities overheat, our reliance upon air conditioning increases, which makes cities overheat, right? And so how we sort of, intervene in that sort of again, kind of terrifying dynamic is, I think, a real opportunity for architects to be creative about, right? I mean, again, this is part of what I'm trying to articulate is all of these problems become kind of sites for exploration, for design exploration, for kind of reconsidering architects as agents of decarbonization again.
And we have another question. Maybe I can read it through so that everybody can hear.
Yeah, sure, please. It didn't work last time.
Thank you for your time and your insightful presentation. I'm intrigued by the ancient architectural designs and technologies utilized for passive cooling in desert climates, like the wind catcher in the Persian Gulf, essentially small towers harnessing temperature variations and wind flow to naturally cool buildings. Do you believe modern architects should shift their focus toward these historical technologies as inspiration for contemporary designs? And this is a question from j'arrive pas, Ryan Amrouche.
I kind of referred to it obliquely a moment ago. Yes, in general. I mean, I think there's a kind of moment where we're looking, any means necessary and kind of really understanding. I mean, I think part of what's embedded here is and why I kind of use this before air conditioning, after comfort kind of framework. The knowledge, what we think of as architectural knowledge, as architectural expertise, has transformed dramatically, right, over the past decade or couple of decades or century. And in many ways become very limited, right? And there's a lot of debate about this relative to engineering, right? Relative to policy and kind of urban planning and kind of, what the architect can do becoming kind of smaller and smaller. But I think at the same time, there's a kind of, as being suggested in this question, there's such a richness to architectural intelligence that expands back centuries, right? And we want to be careful about not being nostalgic, right? I mean, kind of relative to Kate Soper's imperative, not just saying, oh, we're going to, take that tool and use it here. I mean, in some cases that might work, but rather kind of how can we integrate this kind of approach, or how can we, understand that, for example, these wind catchers, are a very careful designed element, regionally specific, climatically specific, that help to solve a very specific issue, right? And that have different dynamics and varieties, around the world. For example, there's been recent research that emphasizes how the Dead Sea salts are very thermally active as heat retention systems, right? That when you can kind of embed them, that a lot of the sort of earth-formed earth brick buildings in some regions of the Middle East took advantage of that kind of thermal capacity, right? That we know about different materials and the kind of thickness of walls in different contexts that allows for different sorts of thermal operations, right? I mean, there's this whole sort of world of, I'm just kind of playing games here, but there's this whole sort of world of environmental and architectural knowledge that, again, the cord was sort of cut by modernism, right? To say, far too schematically, concrete, steel, and glass is the way forward, and all of these other materials and systems, we don't need to kind of worry about them anymore, right? And I mean, it's embarrassing to put it on those terms. It's using far too broad of a brush to discuss a much more nuanced situation. But nonetheless, I think we have to kind of think about a broader swath, a broader period of time that we're kind of in relationship to. But I think the other point to make here, part of what's happened over this last 100 years of air conditioning is that we have been conditioned, right? I mean, we expect, and I say we, meaning kind of those of us in the, over-carbonized economies of the global north and other sites, we have been conditioned to expect a certain type of thermal interior, right? And we walk into an office building or we walk into a house, or we unless it's kind of a beach shack that there's exceptions, of course, but our kind of normal life, it's anticipated that we will have this kind of consistent thermal experience, right? And so part of what we need to recognize is that none of these passive strategies or none of these less energy intensive strategies are going to produce the same amount of cooling, are going to reduce the humidity in the same way, right? So we need to sort of adjust our own expectations. And, we can take great inspiration from the French tradition of shutting down during the summer, right? I mean, maybe we just don't need to work when it, I mean, when I was living in New York and I had a friend in Baltimore in a really hot summer, and if you've been to New York in the summer, the humidity is just unbearable, right? I mean, it's just, you're just kind of wet the whole time. And so we sort of played this game as, you know, as tenured academics, doesn't matter if I write another article or not, it's not a kind of life or death situation, right? I mean, like how long can we kind of continue to maintain our work life without air conditioning in a, you know, in a kind of 100% humidity? And not long, you know, it was a couple of days, you know, and it was pretty brutal. And so, okay, so maybe, you know, take those 2 weeks off, right? I mean, again, if one has the privilege to do so, but how do we sort of begin to adjust our expectations? And again, there's a whole dynamic around this about working from home and, you know, office buildings, and do they need to be occupied, and the sort of post-COVID office dilemma that takes us kind of somewhere else. But yeah, it's in part just to say that these things are all, I think, in a condition of flux, and as architects, we have the opportunity to start to intervene and point the world in some directions. Yeah.
Maybe as a link to the next question we have, and maybe we can take this one and maybe just one more before wrapping up. Yeah, because you're talking here about, like you said, if one has the privilege to do so, but but the thing is that it ought not to be a privilege. It ought to be like a political transformation also, probably, right? Otherwise, they'll remain a privilege, right? The privilege of like going away when it's too hot, or changing hemisphere as the world goes, etc., or not having necessarily to work, things like that. So bringing in the political question, there is this question by Valentine, who said, "Good evening, thank you for your very interesting presentation. I've been wondering about something for a while, and I can't help but thinking about here too. Carbon management, as much as planning and construction management, are eminently political, and I have the impression that this is a thought that is not often given in the world of architecture and architectural research. It's true that research gives us plenty of leads on new ways of building, or brings forgotten or underestimated methods to the fore. And it's true that it's essential to pass on this knowledge to students and future architects. But we can be fairly certain that it won't be enough to influence contemporary and future policies, because it's not architects themselves who are making the political decisions around the world. How do you envision these questions and the already very convincing architectural responses to them penetrating the political and decision-making sphere and having a real impact on planning and therefore construction in the broadest sense? How can we ensure that these essential initiatives and reflections become a way of doing things rather than mere experiments or paper projects?
Yeah, great. Very, very crucial question, and I'll try to kind of throw a few things at it. I don't think there's a obvious solution in a way, right? I share the anxiety. You know, I'll just note that I was quite happy when I came to Australia to have the chance right off the bat to begin working with some colleagues, architects who are in government, right? So there is, on the one hand, I mean, there's a state level minister and a city councillor, right? I mean, people that were trained at the school that I'm now running at UTS, very embedded in these policy making decisions, right? So it's another question of sort of what is architectural knowledge? What is architectural intelligence? What do we want to cultivate? How do we see ourselves engaging in the world? What sort of advocacy do we want to bring together? And you know, I mean, I'm sort of, this can get into a sort of fantasy land very quickly, right? But I kind of want to cultivate that, right? I mean, to allow oneself to kind of imagine these different futures. As we recognize that the kind of traditional tools, the traditional sort of projects of the architect are diminishing, right? I mean, we're no longer all here to sort of build sort of jewel box museums, right? Or different, you know, I mean, to speak again far too schematically, as we kind of try to shift from a mode of architecture that's about sort of refined design practices, often dedicated to the privileged class, how do we restructure our ambitions, right? How do we restructure our aspirations? And this is, of course, really crucial for thinking about what do we teach, right? And how do we form our curricula? And what is the kind of emphasis? And if we're no longer, I mean, most schools, I'm kind of working on this here, most schools still have studio courses where you're making buildings ground up, right? And you're designing an office building, or you're designing a house, or a social housing project. Is that going to be relevant to the architects working in 10, 20 years when the carbon costs are so extreme, right? And, in some places, yes. I mean, there's not an obvious answer, but I think we want to be providing a lot of different types of tools. And one of those tools is advocacy. One of those skills is advocacy, right? And how we see architects taking our intelligence, taking our spatial and environmental and climatological even intelligence, right? And bringing it into the political sphere, right? So I think that's one important piece of it. But I get really, I mean, the question sets me off a little bit, because I get, really concerned. I mean, I spent some time in Hong Kong a few months ago, and as I talked with colleagues in, again, New York and Munich and Berlin and around the world, how to put this, that, the kind of mainstream approach is not really taking on the intensity of the problem, right? I mean, which is to say, even in a place like Hong Kong, where the climate is so intense and the capacity to manage it increasingly expensive, there's a lot of sort of business as usual practices, right? There's a lot of very familiar types of practice, and that's necessary. This is architects making their money. This is paying the bills. This is not indulgence in some formalist fantasy. This is just everyday life. And so, how do we really begin to map out professional pathways that emphasize this question of decarbonization, right? And I think there's a lot of opportunity there. What I like to think of as degrowth opportunities, right, rather than growth opportunities, and insofar as it can be connected to broader streams of thinking about economies and how they operate, and how they can become more horizontal rather than vertical, right? But you look around in most urban centers, and there's still a lot of cranes, and there's still a lot of construction going on, and this really is not something that's kind of feeding into the building industry and the kind of, as noted, the kind of policy world in more effective ways. So, it's a similar question. It's a kind of broader question about how do we really, I guess I would maybe end with this, right? I mean, I think this is probably the last moment here, but that how do we really be, if we really take this kind of architects as agents of decarbonization seriously, in the context of broader political and social movements to change the way we live and the way we operate relative to climate pressures, how do we really take advantage of, appreciate the tools and the skills and the knowledge we have, and focus it on this question of climate? What are the skills and tools and courses and studios and practices that we need to cultivate on those terms? Again, this is a broad disciplinary project, and it's happening in bits and pieces. And I think part of what we're trying to capture in the After Comfort series are some of that discourse of, making the assumption that the architect of the future will be focusing on these decarbonization strategies, right? And so let's start now, basically.
Thank you very much for
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. Good start to my day. Yeah.
That's great. That's great. Well, thanks again. I think we'll call it a night, and we'll wish you an excellent day, Daniel. Thanks again. I don't know if Alice, you want to say a few words of conclusion.
No, thanks again, everybody, to be here, and we'll speak with Daniel soon.
Again. Yeah, great. I look forward to seeing you at the end of the month.
We'll be back with us soon for the panel discussion that we'll have on the 29th, so the first day of the White Week. Thanks again. That was great.
Pleasure.
Thanks for making this effort, and we'll talk very soon. Thank you to all those who have followed this lecture, and we'll speak soon.
Okay, sounds good. Okay.
Bye.
Cheers.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you very much. Bye.